What's up, Red Letter Disciples? It's Zach Zender, co-host of the Red Letter Disciple. In a couple of minutes, Chris Johnson's going to join me, my co-host and pastor in Lake Mary, Florida, and friend. And we have a desire that this podcast would challenge you to be a greater disciple of Jesus in your everyday life. Hey, today on the podcast is Gregory Baumer. He is the co-author of True Riches, What Jesus Really Said About Money and Your Heart. It is one of the best books, hands down. Probably my favorite book I've read so far in 2024, but it's so good talking about what generosity ought to look like in today's world. And amazingly, like the guts of this thing was written as Greg was doing a research project in Harvard Business School. That's right. We're going to find out what Jesus said about money and how we can be generous. Plus, he changes the question from how much do I have to give or need to give? And he asks a very different, and I believe better, important first question that all of us should be asking when it comes to generosity. So you'll hear that in today's episode. That, my friends, is a cliffhanger. There you go. But hey, I'm so thankful for today's partner, Dwelling 114. Dwelling 114. Dwelling 114 is a discipleship organization led by another Greg Finke, who helps churches create disciple-making strategies at their churches. In the Gospels and even in the letters from Paul in the Bible, we see redemptive movements break out wherever Christ followers live. Likewise, in other parts of the world today, we see similar results. But in North America, despite having Christ followers in every community, we aren't seeing those kind of results. Why not? What have we missed about how Jesus discipled his followers, and how can we fix it? Based on his wildly popular book, Joining Jesus on His Mission, Greg has developed a year-long training process that helps your church produce greater disciples in their everyday lives. It's simple, it's biblical, and it works. The one-year training is called Missional Lifestyle Training Process, and Greg has worked this with hundreds of churches and tens of thousands of people. He's an experienced practitioner and mentor, and he's ready to help your congregation too. So you can contact him at his website. You can go to dwelling114.org and imagine a year from now and the people of your congregation are doing it. They're living on mission with Jesus as a daily lifestyle. They have stories of changed lives, changed neighborhoods, and changed workplaces. This doesn't just have to be a dream or a vision. It can be a reality that's happening in your church. And so what do you need to do to arrive there in just 1 year? Greg Finke can help. Again, you can find out more or contact Greg Finke at dwelling114.org. Additionally, I'll be having Greg Finke on a Red Letter Leaders webinar next month in May, where he's going to unpack even more just for church leaders. And so you can register for that free webinar and find that at our show notes at redletterpodcast.com. In just a moment, we'll get into the episode, but a quick time to say, hey, thank you so much for those of you who are listening to the podcast. I want to ask you, if you are a regular listener, can you do two things? Number one, can you rate or review us on whatever your favorite platform might be? And then secondly, if this podcast is meaningful and helpful to you, would you share it with a friend so we can get the word out and impact more lives and change more people for the benefit and glory of Christ? All right, with all that said, let's do this. Hey, here at the Red Letter Disciple, we are pretty excited today talking to Greg Baumer, who is co-author of a couple of amazing, and when I say amazing, I mean amazing books that I've read. God and Money is the first one, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. So that's going to be fun. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. And then the next one, True Riches, What Jesus Really Said About Money and Your Heart. And you know we're really passionate about what Jesus says. So that's pretty exciting.
Greg is a long-suffering Indiana Hoosier fan.
As well. So we may talk about suffering for a good bit of this, right?
Long-suffering.
That's where most of my sanctification is.
That's awesome, man. So Greg, welcome to Red Letter Disciple, man. We're really happy to have you on. And to talk.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Really excited about the opportunity.
Yeah, cool. So a little lead up to this first question, but I was first introduced to you and your co-author, John Cortinas, on the Bible Project podcast.
Great
Great podcast, doing great work. And I really thought you two had such a powerful story when it comes to giving and generosity, and resonated with what you were saying. And I also thought, man, that a lot of people need to hear what you guys have to say. And so both of you had a different path, and I want you to tell us about that. One was a spender, one was a saver. And even with these goals.
Like you and me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But even with these goals, like you were still tithing and doing like all the things that churches tell you. And like it on the outside seemed well, but like there wasn't that fulfillment. And so you went to Harvard Business School, and that's where you learned somehow to be generous or to learn more about giving. And so walk me through like your path, you and John's, and how you landed on a Bible Project podcast and why you're on ours today after the author of a couple of books on giving.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'll tell you one thing. We did not enroll at Harvard Business School with the intention of learning how to give more money away. Just further evidence of God's work in mysterious ways. So my close friend and co-author John and I became friends in graduate school and quickly realized that we grew up on sort of opposite sides of the coin when it comes to how one might think about money. However, there were also some similarities in our upbringing. So both of us grew up in good Christian homes, good Christian parents, good churches, involved in youth group, came to faith as kids, that type of thing. Also both interested in business from a young age. We both had started small businesses in high school, were fascinated with the business world and the concept of making money. And for both of us, it never occurred to us that there may be some theological intersection between our involvement with the church and love for Jesus and our involvement in the business world.
Wait a second. What kind of business do you start in high school? What did you start in high school? You can't just smooth over that thing. That's not a lot of entrepreneurs in the 10th grade. So tell us what's going on.
Nor applying to Harvard.
Yes.
But anyway, we'll go with the high school.
Let's go with high school first.
Yeah, both evidence of similar character issues. So so John started a lawn mowing business.
Yeah.
And he made a lot of money in high school. He worked hard in those Texas summers. I was a bit more nefarious. I downloaded CDs for my friends on Napster. So I convinced my parents to get a second phone line, and I would burn CDs like overnight. I could make one per day, and I would sell them for like $5 or $8 to my friends. So
your buddy's out there like working his tail off in Texas summers at 95 degrees, and you're ripping CDs.
Work smarter, not harder, man.
Right.
I think that's in Proverbs somewhere.
That's great.
But I didn't know it was illegal at the time.
Sure.
Been living a life of crime ever since. But those were the businesses we started. But I raised that point only to say that this was like an area that we were interested in from a young age, each of us. And to be clear, we didn't know each other. We met in our 20s in grad school. But in both of our cases, as we entered our professional careers, we developed a really unhealthy identity wrapped up in career success. I know we're probably like the only two people who have ever done that. No, I mean, that's pretty common. Like, we're not unique, but I do think we were a bit unique in the degree to which that defined us in our own minds. And the way you keep score with that is money. What I was really tracking was my worth is in my career success. The way I measured that was money. And I wouldn't have been able to articulate that back in my mid-20s, but God has given me the clarity ex post that that's what was happening. Same for John. We just kept score a little differently. I like to spend the money, and he liked to save the money.
Okay.
Meanwhile, we were both going to churches in the communities where we were living. We were tithing, but that's just because we had learned to do that growing up. And frankly, it assuaged my guilt, giving me, the faux freedom to go spend the other 90% of the money however I wanted on myself. That's like really what was happening. It was not worship, namely. I actually think it was this misaligned identity that resulted in us enrolling at Harvard Business School. They call it the West Point of capitalism for a reason.
Yeah.
And here I found myself in this Bible study with 6 other guys, John being one of those guys. That's where we met. And being there with these 6 other guys, there were 7 of us. We were all married, so the 14 of us became friends. It forced us to ask this question of how does our faith intersect with how we think about and spend money? It was the first time I'd ever thought deeply about that question. About that same time, we had the chance to cross-register into a class over at Harvard Divinity School called God and Money that explored the intersection of faith and finance in our culture. And for our final term paper for that course, we wrote about how we would try to be wise stewards if we were ever blessed with more financial resources than we needed. And if I'm being honest, really, we were exploring like how little can we give to still be in God's good graces. But I think as we'll discuss, God had very different plans for that paper. We read the whole Bible front to back, everything it had to say about money, 2,350 verses. And we also surveyed 200 Harvard Business School alumni who were Christians. We had their emails from them being in the same Bible study over the years.
Yeah.
And we asked them very personal questions about how much they make, their net worth, how much they give, where they give. And as God so often does, he used a combination of his word and the example of his children living it out in real life to totally transform our views. So that is where God sort of had us in the crucible. And that's where our eyes were open to this whole new reality.
That's so cool. And I think what I loved about your story too is, as a pastor, I think if I have a successful young businessman who's frankly doing pretty well on the financial money side, and I see that 10% tithe check, like I'm grateful. Like I want more of you, more of people like you. And I think, on your side, it's like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So now I've sort of got the guilt side of it taken care of. So now I can do what I want with the spending. John, in his case, can do what he wants with the saving, because again, we're checking the boxes, and honestly, we're making our pastors really happy because not many are tithing. And so like, at least we're doing that. And yet when you started reading through the Bible, and especially doing the surveys with those who had been through Harvard Business School, you saw kind of, as you said, like the word opened up with these personal stories. And what'd you find? What stuck out to you, or what caused a change in you from all of that?
Yeah. First, to your point about pastors being happy if someone's tithing, I agree. And I think really that is evidence of the low bar we've set for ourselves. I think in a culture where our most pervasive sin is materialism, we've lowered the bar on what good stewardship looks like, to the point that even church leaders are happy with the disappointing outcome. And please hear me, that doesn't mean the percentage of one's income. That means the percentage of what is mine actually belongs to God in my heart and in my mind. That's the disconnect. And then that manifests in giving. And, for many people, like 10% is a lot, like is highly sacrificial. For other families, it's not as much. That's not so much the point. The point is more, do I believe everything I have belongs to God? Mm-hmm. And that leads to your question. What God most taught us through this work is the following sort of logic train. Point number one, everything we have truly belongs to him. That's not novel. If you ask any Christian that, they would intellectually assent to that point. Yeah. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is he convicted us on the gap between what I professed to believe and what I was practicing. Mm-hmm. It was a deep conviction that I would say, in sin, not specifically because of how I was spending my money, but rather because I professed that it all belonged to God, but didn't act or think at all as though that were true.
Wow.
So it was hypocritical of me. So that was point number one. If I'm going to truly believe in my heart that everything belongs to him, then everything ought to be used for his purposes. That includes providing for our family, as we read in 1 Timothy, where we have a specific command to provide for our family. So what I'm not saying is you have to give everything away and you can't have any possessions. But it does mean that everything is his and ought to be used for his purposes.
Yeah.
If that is true, then John and I realized we were asking the wrong question. We were asking the question, how much do I need to give? I think that is how most people think of it. Is it 10%? Is it 12%? Asking the question that way starts with the implied assumption that it's all mine. How much of my stuff am I giving?
Yeah.
God laid it on our hearts to reverse the question to, how much do I really need to keep?
Yeah.
Asking the question, how much do I really need to keep, begins with the assumption that it's all his, a portion of which I will keep to provide for my family, but the rest of which can then be poured back into his kingdom for his purposes.
Yeah.
And that was the big unlock for us. And so then the rest of the project was saying, how will we apply that question in our lives?
That's good.
Yeah.
And so as you and John were going through this, and it turned into more than a research paper that that was just words on paper. It turned into, man, we've got to do something about this. if this is really true. And so I'm just curious because you were married when you had this perspective, world-changing moment. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, at the time.
Both of us were married, yes.
So, and
still are, by the way.
There you go. I love that. And my wife, Allison, was the one that told me, hey, you got to listen to these guys on the Bible Project podcast. Because we're both doing writing soon on generosity and giving. And so we're in that study phase. And so anything we're finding, we're sharing with one another. But how do you ensure, like, if you're having this moment, I've had this as a pastor too at other times, that where I'm having this really great spiritual moment and God's doing something and teaching me something. And yet my whole life up to that point was over in this direction. And now we're going to be moving in this direction. And so how do you, I guess, catch your spouse up? In the book, True Riches, you said that you and your wife both idolize security. And I would imagine some of that came from finance and came from bank account. And by the way, you and your wife are not the only ones that idolize security. A lot of us do. And so if it's all of a sudden different, like how does a spouse bring another spouse into this so that this is something we're doing together?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I'll say is that John and I are both so fortunate to be married to women who more naturally abide in the Spirit than he and I do. We get so intellectual and I think some hubris around we can solve this, even if it's on like a faith-based topic, where our wives are both like, I think, more oriented toward just abiding in him. So it was actually an easier journey. Practically speaking, another huge element of God's grace in this story is his timing to teach us these lessons. That is to say, he taught them to us while we were poor graduate students. We each had like low to negative net worth with student loans. And I think it's so much easier to learn these lessons in that position than later in life when a net worth has been accumulated and a whole lifestyle has been built around it. And it's really hard to unwind that. Not so much because you can't sell the house or whatever, but rather because your whole social community, your kids' community is oriented around a certain way of living, and unwinding that's tough.
Yeah.
So I'm so grateful that God taught us these lessons now. As John and I have had the opportunity to continue working in the biblical generosity space, as it were, over the past 10 years, one of the most common situations is where the spouses are not at the same spot on the journey. My observation would be twofold. One is clearly it is unwise for one spouse to start taking dramatic action in this area of biblical generosity without their spouse being aligned. So don't do that. I've definitely seen that. In one's enthusiasm, one get a bit too overzealous, and that's not great. But two, and more importantly, like view it as an opportunity to work toward marital harmony and unity, which is hard to align on. And in that sense, it can be uplifting and a way to pour into the marriage, using the money topic as a way to breed overall unity. I am sad when I see people prioritize their financial planning over their marriage. I think our marriages are images of Christ and the church, and have primacy over whether my financial plan is like holy enough or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I would definitely encourage people to like prioritize the spousal alignment over a good budget.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, as a pastor, both of us being pastors, and I just started a church plant about 12 months ago. And so I have a lot of 25, 30-year-olds, and a lot of them were unchurched. And so moving somebody from completely unchurched to like then trying to get them to come to church regularly, which is a hurdle. And then to the next hurdle, which is them giving their first financial, and helping them understand. A lot of pastors will preach, hey, a tithe is a good barometer. I've heard a lot of pastors say, hey, Jesus wants you to be a joyful giver.
Right.
And so I don't know. I'm curious about your perspective, because the churches have been screaming about tithes for a long time, and it doesn't seem to be working very well. And so less than 3% of Americans give 10% each week. And so as we think about that, 1 in 20 that claim to have a faith in Jesus are actually tithing. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what would be your recommendation to pastors today? Would it be, hey, let's talk about the tithe. Let's talk about how it was formed. Let's talk about how the farmers gave away 10% of their field. Or like, I don't know. I'm just curious what your perspective would be, because quite honestly, I'm struggling with it for not personally, but I'm struggling with how to teach this to a generation that's 6 months ago said, I'm not going to church, and now they're going to church. So, like, it's tricky.
Great question. Yeah, I think if I learned the most important thing I've learned by God's grace over the past 10 years is, at first, this was all about like how to be a wise steward.
Yeah.
The money God's given me, how can I use it wisely? Save, spend, give. Over the past 10 years, God has broadened that to a much deeper theological truth, which I now think is like the much more important lesson. And it's twofold. One is enrich our understanding that God is the ultimately generous one. And so I think, the best teaching on generosity is not about what we ought to do, but rather what he has done and will do. And so to the degree that we can anchor our teaching and giving around God's character as radically generous, it will build up in us an outflowing of the Spirit who is God to exhibit that character through us. So that's one. Two, it's critical that we as Christ followers understand why God calls us to give before we get into the how. If we don't know why we're doing it, the tactics don't matter. First, let's start with the wrong answer. The wrong answer is God doesn't need our money, right? He's not waiting around for me to give to accomplish his purposes. He's sovereign and he'll accomplish his purposes no matter what I do. So God doesn't need our money. That's truth number one. If so, why does he call us to give? I would offer three main reasons. The first is that God himself is ultimately generous, as I mentioned before. And so it's a way to better understand his character, as I said. The second is because generosity is one of many traits of Christ that we're called to replicate or exhibit. That is, grow in sanctification, grow in Christ-likeness. And generosity is one of many ways that we're called to emulate Jesus. And then third is, for some reason, the way that God has designed the universe is that we sinful humans actually participate alongside him in bringing forth his kingdom here on earth, which is amazing. And generosity is one of many ways that we get to do that. So I think when we frame the why around those three things, God himself is generous and we want to understand his character. We want to become more like Jesus and we get to participate in his kingdom work. When we give out of that mindset, that is joyful worship. And that is why God calls us to give joyful worship. I think that's what it is. At the end of the day, he calls us to give as an act of joyful worship. If we teach that, then I think the tactics flow more naturally.
Yeah, that's really well said.
So when you switched from that mindset of how much do I need to give or have to give to how much do we need to keep? What do we need to live on? Like, how's that practically, what did you do at that point in your life to match that new question you're asking?
And to follow up, how much do we have to give to make sure that we get into heaven? Go ahead.
Exactly. Well, I just prefer using the algorithm in Thessalonians. No, there's no formula, right? I mean, that's, like everyone wants to know.
Right. Just tell me what I have to do. Just tell me what I have to do. Come on.
And I think like conspicuous by its absence is a phrase that applies here, meaning if God wanted it to be that algorithmic, he would have provided the algorithm.
Right.
So truth number one is the answer will vary, and that God is doing calculus different than how we humans do calculus, as he so often does in his upside down kingdom. So I think the main thing I would say here is actually connecting to my prior point about joyful worship. The way that manifests annually or, whatever budget cycle you're on is the wrestling with him on what to do for that period of time. For my wife and I, it's annual. And I think that that's answer number one. If you're not wrestling with God, whatever, annual or how often you budget, that is the first step. Start doing that. Now, that being said, I do think at the end of the day, you have to make a decision on how much to give. So it has to get tactical.
Yeah.
What John and I did is nerd out big time, which is like very in line with our personalities. So we studied like all this different, what did church fathers do and say about this? What was common in like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance? What has like the good life been defined by over time? And we triangulated all of that into the following. We believe it is biblical to use the resources that God has given us to provide safety, opportunity, and flourishing for our family without seeping into luxury simply for luxury's sake. So again, safety, opportunity, and flourishing without luxury simply for luxury's sake. What's luxury? That will vary by context. It also doesn't mean I never indulge in luxury. My wife and I are celebrating our 15th wedding anniversary in May of this year. And we're going to go on a nice trip. And I feel great about spending that money.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that money being spent is worshipful because we're celebrating this union that God has blessed us with.
Yeah. It's
But
cool.
we also don't do that every other Tuesday, right? It's like it's purposeful. What luxury will look like will vary depending on your context. When we studied this, when we wrote the book, that was in 2015. So to be fair, that's like almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'll qualify a few of these things. We actually we thought about what would safety, opportunity, and flourishing look like for a family of 4 in an average cost of living city. And in a funny coincidence, in 2015, when we looked at the census data, Omaha, Nebraska was the 1.00 index on average cost of living city in the U.S.
Come on, baby. We are so average here. I love it.
This is pretty funny. So we landed on a number of $100,000 a year in cash spending. So like that's literally like money out the door. So savings and giving is above that. And that is the ceiling. Like a lot of people will never even get to that number. And then you have to adjust for things. So like, we have 4 kids now. We're a family of 6. My wife and I both have younger brothers with developmental disabilities that we'll be caring for when our parents no longer can care for them. We live in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a higher than average cost of living city. And, now it's 2024 and we've had a high inflation period of time. So like you can do all that math, but the point is to come up with a lifestyle that is, I think nice, but not extravagant. The other thing I would say is a great quote from Pastor John Tyson at Church and City in New York is, he has this great sermon on generosity. And he says that Christians ought to live with provocative lifestyle distinction, by which he means that our lives should look markedly different than those in our peer set. And he says that's true across all dimensions of virtue. But then he proceeds to say, like, this sermon today is about money. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So it should apply for money as well. So whatever your peer group is by income or net worth, your life should look markedly different. I think if you combine those things, you can land on a number. And then we do the same thing for net worth, which is basically, depending on how old you are, you need that many years worth before you plan to go.
That's good.
So that's how we think.
Yeah, no, and I love it. So correct me if I'm wrong. The one summary I think I just heard in all of that was you couldn't have done your study without Omaha, Nebraska.
Critical.
Is that
critical.
the main point?
Yes.
Okay, so there you go.
Main point.
I think that's all we needed you for here today, Greg. So no.
Guys, this has been great, guys. Yeah, catch you next time.
Thank you.
No, I love it. And in the book True Riches, you actually have sort of the breakdown, the algorithm, some exercises for people to go through. So that there is like some legit planning. Like this should not be such a pie in the sky or intent thing. Like we can actually write stuff down, create plans, create budgets, and go for these things. And that's what I think is really great. You mentioned like there is no algorithm, in 1 Thessalonians or in the Bible that tells us anything. And I think there'd be some that would disagree and say, actually, no, it is the tithe. and yet when I'm really big on like looking to Jesus when we have a problem or trying to find the answer, and he just doesn't talk much about tithing. Only once, and he didn't say not to do it. He didn't really give a great glowing recommendation to do it. It was actually not even the focus of the one thing he said about. And then when you look in the Old Testament, which I had never done, and I've been in the ministry until going through you guys' stuff and reading some of the books that you guys read, like that talk about Old Testament tithing. Like, I never knew that there were multiple tithes in the Old Testament. And I don't think anybody teaches this today.
That's
like
right.
there's 3 tithes for the normal person. There's 1 tithe for the Levites, and the high priests have no tithe. And if they're poor, they weren't really expected to. Am I right?
Exactly.
So maybe
isn't that nuance amazing?
It is,
right?
but like nobody talks about that. And so that's where I think like people will say the algorithm is the tithe. And it's like, not really if you look into it. And also there are lots of people like you that have tithe that it wasn't fulfilling and it wasn't really doing it the right way. And so walk me through a little bit, because I'm really wrestling truthfully as a pastor. Because again, if I could get everybody to tithe, man, our church would be great. I can't do that. Not many are. But
He's tried to force people to.
But walk me through a little bit of what you found in the Old Testament when it comes to tithing and what those practices were. And then we'll jump into the New Testament and what Jesus had to say after that.
Super. Yeah, we were similarly fascinated by what we found in the Old Testament when we studied this deeply. So, as you mentioned, Zach, there are 3 tithes in the Old Testament. One is 10% given to the church, as it were, and 2 is 10% to throw a week-long party.
The festivals,
which is amazing. Yeah. And it's like, I don't know why we don't do that.
I was going to say, I'm going to implement that at my new church.
That's what I was thinking. Like with that one, God loves to party. What if 10% of our money went towards kingdom cause, like celebrations? How cool would that be? But anyway, keep going.
That'd be amazing. Like imagine if churches spent 10% of their budget on a week-long block party that the community was invited to.
I'm going.
Right. And like, it's funny to joke about. Yeah. And also it's like, why don't we do? Right. So I think we should do that. I've tried to convince my group of friends to do that, and I think we're going to do like a smaller scale version of it.
Cool.
And then the final tithe was done every 3 years, and that was for the poor. So if you average that one, it's like 3% a year on average. So if you add them up, it's like 23% a year. So whenever someone is like really firm on the tithe, I'm like, great, 23%.
And they're like, wait, what? I thought it was 10%.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it's a joke, but I think a tithe is like, that's great for getting practical. For a lot of people in today's environment with current rising cost of living expenses and other challenges, like a tithe is a wonderful target. The important thing is the heart underneath it. Have you given all of your belongings over to the Lord, and have you wrestled with him such that you've landed on that number in dialogue with him? And then you're worshiping him through that gift. That's way more important.
Yeah.
So I think that I would emphasize that point.
That's so good. And so, Chris, you got to give 23%. That's Old Testament. Now we're New Testament and Jesus. And I always hear the people, well, if 10% was the rule in the Old Testament and now we're saved by grace, we should give even more. Right? And so there's all this out there. And I'm just like, I don't know. So when you looked at the teachings of Jesus, which again, that's exactly where I want to be landing, is like, we don't need to reinvent anything. Like, let's look at what Jesus said, how he gave. What did you find when you opened up the teachings of Jesus when it came to giving, generosity, money, all those things?
Sure. So first, an observation, something like a quarter to a third of his teaching and parables are about money.
Crazy.
I think that as much as we say today, we're in sort of a financialized world, must have been true back then because it was like, he viewed it as equally important to the mind of humans back then. 2 is let's accept the warning that he offers. Almost all of his teaching on money is a warning about the dangerous possible effects of money. And I think we should heed that warning and realize we are prone, our error risk as modern day people is toward consumerism and materialism and the love of more and the love of money. And so, as Tim Keller says, our base assumption should be that we are committing the sin of greed. And we should just orient from that base assumption. And I think if you look at Jesus' teaching, that was true in those days too. And then, as is the case in many other areas of virtue as well, Jesus doesn't get super specific.
Yeah.
He always is saying, I want your heart.
Yeah.
Which I think what that means tactically in this specific area of money is you've given everything you have to me. This is God. You've given everything to me, and you're allowing me to direct its uses in obedience to my calling for your life. I think that is what Jesus cares a lot more about than how much you're giving. And I think we can actually use the how much we're giving debate as a faux argument to not do the hard heart work of I'm really materialistic and I need to confess that sin and give it over to Jesus.
I had a really good friend. He grew up Catholic, and his whole family, they always tithed, right? And so he started coming to my church, and he always tithed. And they were having a really rough month. And he walked in, and I know him well enough. And I said, "What's up, man?" "Nothing." And from the beginning of church, he was angry. And at the very end, right before the very end, he was helping me usher. And I whispered, "What's going on?" He goes, "I'm having a really tough month, and I can't really swing the tithe this month." I said, "Then don't tithe." And he was like, "What?" I was like, "Don't tithe, dude. Jesus says, if this is going to make you not be a joyful giver, don't freaking do it for 1 week and come back when you're feeling more joyful." And you could see just the release from that legalistic law. And it was kind of a cool moment, actually, because it was ruining his whole work. He couldn't even worship because he was worried about his tithe,
Swinging the tithe. I like that language.
Swinging the tithe.
But one of my things is, nothing, we can't do anything perfectly. I get that when it comes to discipleship and measuring discipleship. But this to me does feel like, again, we teach at Red Letter 5 targets for how to follow Jesus. Being, which is all about growing spiritual disciplines, forgiving, receiving grace, giving grace away, serving, obviously serving others with our time and our talent. Giving is the one we're talking about today, and the one we're studying about. And then going, which is, of course, sharing God, evangelism. Giving to me seems like one of the 5 targets that you actually can measure this. So we talk about discipleship is impossible to measure, and I'm not there. I think it may be trickier in other ways, but this is an area where I feel like if a person really took the time, they can see where you see in your credit card statements and your bank accounts. Every year I do my taxes. I know my AGI and my adjusted gross income, and I know my charitable contributions.
What is it?
What's your
AGI?
All of it's there. And so that the more we can help people see and plan. And so I think I heard from you, to do a couple different plans, right? It's kind of an annual plan of what do we need to keep, and then a kind of a long-term net worth of how much in our net worth do we need to keep? Is that correct? And so how would a person go about doing that?
That's how we think about it, with that latter category being more applicable for people who are in a position of surplus.
Okay.
So I think everyone ought to think about, whether it's annual or monthly, the Lord has entrusted me with this. It's His. Here's how I'm going to use it. And this is not just about how much will I give. It's also how will I save and how will I spend in ways that are honoring to God and in alignment with His calling. Because many other important factors come into play. How am I raising my children? How am I aligning with my spouse? How am I caring for extended family? A bunch of those things are not just about how much am I giving to charity, but they are critical, spirit-laden financial questions.
Yeah.
So that's step 1. 2 is for those who are blessed with more than they need, and thus are accumulating savings over time. The error risk can be saving up more and more and more because we keep inventing new possible risks that could happen to us. We see in Proverbs that saving is wise. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't save. I am saying we shouldn't oversave.
Yeah.
Like Scrooge, like Scrooge McDuck, just doing the backflip and the gold coins. That's what I'm imagining at this point. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Exactly. And I think in the church, we've actually accidentally elevated that mindset toward money.
Yeah.
If you look at most elder boards in churches, they're filled with the rich people in the church.
Yeah.
Not always.
Sure.
But often. I will say that, some of those people also have important business experience or other professional experience that is like relevant.
Yeah.
So I get that. But I also think that much of the honor goes to the wealthy people in the church. And it is sort of prestigious in church culture to spend less, like spend under your means, but save a lot.
Yeah.
And that's considered some sort of like biblically responsible. And I want to just push on that some to say, I think what actually happens is those people end up finding their security in their stuff rather than anchoring their security in their Savior.
Totally.
And as they get more money, they invent new what if scenarios to the point where, they're solving for things that have a 1 in a billion chance of happening. And like, I'm going to save up for that. Mm-hmm. So I just, we should save, but we shouldn't oversave.
Like building a gigantic bunker in Hawaii.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Look, I saw online the other day, you can buy a bucket of food that will last 25 years.
Yeah, I've got 4 of them, so I'm good for the next 100 years. It's pretty good. Is that not how it works?
That's so funny.
No, I think that's give us this day our daily, yearly.
Give us this day our
quarter century bread.
Our quarter century bread.
Yeah, dehydrated, flash frozen bread.
But I love that too, and that's where I love like the root of your material. A lot of it focuses on generosity, and even as I'm writing Giving Challenge, like I'm not writing Saving Challenge or Spending Challenge or Investing Challenge, because honestly, there's some, like you said, there's proverbs that talk about it's wise to save, but when I look at all the teachings of Jesus, like he doesn't really talk about saving much. And the only times he does are obviously he's talking to people that have oversaved. It's in a negative light. Like a lot more of it's like that daily dependence. It's that give us this day. Like, and so that's where I really resonate with that. And I struggle, like, what's the line? Because I don't want to be like, no, you should never save and for individual, your family, or for the church. But and I think it comes back to, right, is where your heart is. And if your heart's trusting in your savings more than the Savior, then like,
Also, Greg, when you were a criminal back in high school, did you tithe off of your stolen merchandise?
I tithed in Mountain Dew.
Greg, our stories are similar. I think we're both through what is it, statute of limitations. My high school business, me and my buddy.
This guy's fraudulent
we didn't
too.
burn CDs, we burnt DVDs. It was before there was like a 5-year period where DVDs were really popular, but nobody had Seinfeld on DVD.
Yeah.
And so we burnt and sold illegal copies of Seinfeld. I did it for 2 days and then I felt horrible, and my friend kept doing it, and he got forever kicked off of eBay.
Hold on a second.
That is amazing.
So anyway, we share illegal teenage business venture stories.
That is incredible.
And look at how God has intertwined us in our hearts now.
Wait, Greg.
He uses the least of these, right? Like he redeems,
But Greg, you don't know. Hold on. I got to tell you a story, Greg. This is a little off the record. So he goes from being just a top tier criminal, and then he straightens himself out in college. Check this out. This dude worked at a golf shop, and people would buy a set of clubs and they would leave the head cover. So he started collecting all the head covers, and then he started selling them on eBay. Then he went around to the other golf courses and got all their head covers. And the dude like had a close to 6-figure business when he was in seminary off of head covers.
That's genius.
I know.
Man, to me,
I'm so jealous.
You're so jealous.
I'm so jealous. That was so good.
Look, one man's trash is another man's
exactly.
treasure.
That's a perfect.
God was using it to fund a ministry education.
Yeah.
I love that. But yeah, Zach, something you said earlier I think is key, is like, where's the line? And I think
I like that you two are answering where the line is.
Exactly.
I know. I noticed that. I think he got happiest the time I talked about selling illegal DVD with Seinfeld. So he's still living the sanctified life. Like,
incredible creativity. But yeah, I think like people want the specific answer. And then what people who write or speak on this space often say is it's about the heart. I've said this in our conversation. I believe that's true, but that's also unhelpful in some ways because people don't know how to then bring that practically into an actual decision that they implement on how to spend their money this year.
Yeah.
And so I do want to offer that there's give a formula. There is no formula, but we can get a lot more specific than it's about the heart. And so if you like, let's take saving as an example.
Yeah.
I can't tell someone how much to save. What I can say is ask yourself the following questions. What are you saving for? Where is your security? Is your saving for others or for yourself? Is your saving precluding you from generosity that God is calling you toward? Is your saving precluding you from enjoyment of spending such that your marriage or your relationship with your kids is damaged because you're so Scroogey?
Right.
Would you give up the savings if you were called to? Really think honestly about that. So just off the top of my head, there's 5 or 6 questions that are more specific. And I think we can all think of those and get to a spot of, okay, there's no algorithm, but I can know if I'm out of alignment with the Spirit. And you can ask those same things for spending, saving, and giving.
It's good. I think it's so great. And there is a lot of that practical stuff, especially in the True Riches book, which is the latest edition that you guys have. Some of those questions we're going to be asking, because I agree, the heart is a great answer. It's the right answer, but it's not super practical without diving into like, let's get underneath that there. And then how can we shape our heart? I'd love to know when it comes to generosity, not just the act of giving, but also like that. So there's the, how do we do this, but also like the, what are we giving to? I think when you studied that as well, and when you look at Jesus and read through his word, and have been practicing now this for the better part of a decade, like what are in your mind from your study, the best causes that we can give to with our generosity?
Besides Red Letter Disciple.
Thank you.
So some of my favorites are we've spent a lot of time thinking and praying, and also what I'll say is practicing this. That is to say, sometimes we make mistakes, and that is okay. Some people choose not to give because they're worried it won't be used well. I think we should lean toward giving and occasionally making a mistake with that versus being on the opposite side, not giving enough because we're so judgy about how other people might use the money. So a couple thoughts. One is we studied scripture on where God calls people to give in the Bible. And the 3 most frequent causes that God calls people to give. One is serve the poor. That's by far the most common command, just by count of instances in scripture. 2 is spread the gospel, evangelism. And 3 is build the church, disciple existing Christians. And so we try to orient our giving across those 3 columns. Maybe we have a few organizations within each one. A very important one being our local church. I know some people don't like giving to their local church because they don't want to pay for the air conditioning, or you get more bang for your buck, internationally or whatever. I think it's critical to be investing financially where you're entrusting your heart for discipleship. That is to say, your local church. So we give across those 3 columns. We flex each year what the ratio is between those 3 according to what God is calling us toward. So I think that's point 1. Serve the poor, spread the gospel, build the church. And then second is, how do we give? Here, my wife and I have learned some really fun lessons over the past few years. If you connect back to my earlier point that giving should be a joyful act of worship, different people will be able to better worship God through different ways of giving. I'm a spreadsheet guy. So like by January 1st at noon, like I have my giving spreadsheet for the year, and I have all the auto drafts set up, and like I'm thrilled with that. And like I can worship God with that spreadsheet.
With a spreadsheet,
But that does nothing for my wife, right? Like she does not resonate with that, and she is not able to worship her creator through my spreadsheet. So what we've learned to do is allocate a portion of our giving each year, like a meaningful portion, to what we call Allison's slush fund, where she can give anywhere she wants to anyone at any time for any reason. And that has unlocked her ability to better worship God through our giving. And it has had the really positive side effect of bringing us into involvement in local things that he's doing in our community, that the hands and feet of Jesus ought to be involved in, that I may have inadvertently walked past because it wasn't on my spreadsheet.
I love it. And that might have just cost me a lot of money because my
Yeah.
wife's name is Allison as well. And she listens and does the show notes.
Yeah.
And I think...
Guess who's getting the slush fund?
there will be another Allison slush fund here. Thanks to you, Greg.
Yeah.
Can we cut that last one from the post-production? That she didn't need to hear that, see that.
Yeah.
No, I think that's so great. And I've even been wondering too, like with, the online giving and the recurring and the regular, which is so great in many ways. But a lot of that in church culture, at least, that moment's not there in the service anymore. They might show the ways to give on the screen or maybe have a drop box in the back, but we're not actively like, it came out of my bank account, but the day it came out of my bank account, I didn't worship God with that. So I'm really thinking like through that moment.
It's so funny that you say that because I just had a guy last week that says, I will never sign up for online giving because I want to feel the check leaving my hand like I'm actually giving.
Well, and even as a dad, like I want my kid, like they know we give, but they don't get to see mom and dad give if that's not physically there. So I don't know. I'm thinking through those things too. But hey, one more question for you, Greg. We ask all of our guests, this hour's flown by. Super grateful to have you. But if you could challenge our listeners we want to challenge people to be greater disciples of Jesus. So if you could challenge them practically to do one thing this week to be a greater disciple, what would it be?
Give 25% to your local church. All right, Greg, thanks a lot. Have a good.
Yeah, great talking with you guys. Yeah, so what I would say is connecting back to like my main thing I would love to convey, which is that giving should be a joyful act of worship.
Yeah.
We were created to worship God for his glory and our good. A great way to do that is to give in accord with our unique creative spiritual gifts. So the challenge I would have for listeners this week is read the passages about spiritual gifts, identify what one or two of your spiritual gifts might be. Maybe you already know them. And then give money toward a cause or ministry that you are already involved with or that is in alignment with your unique spiritual gifting, and pray for that ministry. And what you have done is align your heart, your time, your money, and your skills with a cause that God has uniquely designed you to impact his kingdom. And I guarantee you will experience joyful worship in that moment.
I love it. All right, awesome. Listeners, so if you take that challenge, if you give generously aligned to one of your spiritual gifts, let us know, #RedLetterDisciple. And if you're like, I've never done a spiritual gift test, we actually created one at Red Letter. It's free for you. Go to spiritualgifts.me.
Say what?
And yeah, you can find out those spiritual gifts there. Greg, man, you have been so helpful. I may be tapping you or John via email or some other way in the future as we create our newest 40-day challenge, not to come out till 2025, but I know a few of your ideas are, you and John's work is going to be probably in there in some way, shape, or form.
Well,
so
make sure you charge this guy for it. He will just lift your stuff and not give you any credit.
Well, yeah, I mean, we do illegal things, apparently.
Just like most of our book is really just rephrasing Randy Alcorn's books, which is like what everyone should actually read. Right. So,
just like Napster, he's going to rip you off.
Yeah, Alcorn does have some really great stuff, and I always tell people with my initial book, Red Letter Challenge, it's Jesus's words that I plagiarized. Right. So
the guy sold hundreds of thousands of copies of Jesus's words.
But hey, man, if people want to connect with you, where can they find you these days?
Yeah, so we have godandmoney.net, and then also involved with an organization called Generous Giving that exists to spread the message of biblical generosity. Check out our events, and also involved with Bible Project. You can go to Bible Project.
Love Bible Project.
Yeah.
Love awesome. Bible Project. Those guys are getting it done.
We'll put all those links in the show notes, and people check those links and resources out. Awesome, Greg. Thanks, man, for being on with us today. Appreciate you.
Guys, thanks so much. Ton of fun.
Well, I hope you got all of that today from Gregory Baumer. It's not about how much do I need to give for many of us. It's about how much do I need to keep. Honestly, that can be a life-changing question. for each of us to wrestle with in our own lives. It's so good. So, hey, if you want to get the book or learn more about Gregory Baumer, you can go to our show notes today at redletterpodcast.com. It's there you can also connect with Greg Finke and hear more about how he and his mission organization, Dwelling 114, can help your church produce greater followers of Jesus. If you want to go right to Greg Finke's website, again, you can do that at dwelling114.org. And remember, in May, I'll be leading a free webinar with Greg Finke to help you, pastor or church leader, create a disciple-making plan at your church. And so you can register for that free webinar. Again, you can find the link for the webinar in our show notes at redletterpodcast.com. Speaking of Greg Finke, we got a lot of Greg stuff going on in this episode. He's going to be my guest on the podcast next week. I can't wait for you to hear Greg's take on how to follow Jesus, the question that he loves to ask people who do believe in Jesus, and just kind of the art of hanging out and how good Jesus was at hanging out and how we can be better hangouters. Is that how you say it? I don't know. We're going to find out more. But if you're wondering, like, how do I follow Jesus practically? What does that look like on the day-to-day? Greg's an expert with that, and I can't wait for next week. It's really going to help you be a greater disciple of Jesus, which is the point of this podcast. So make sure you don't miss it. You can subscribe or follow on whatever platform you listen to. And again, if this was meaningful for you today, share it with a friend. Let's keep the audience growing and help more and more people become the great disciples of Jesus that he has called them to be.